How's it going, guys? Welcome back to our study in the book of Hebrews. Now, last week, we talked about how the theme for this whole book is better, right? Jesus is better than anything else that this world has to offer. We talked about how Jesus is better than the angels or any other created thing last week, and we talked about how people have tried to complicate the gospel with all kinds of other stuff and extra steps. When in reality, guys, it all comes back to Jesus, right? He's the only way to God the Father. And this week, we're going to jump forward to Hebrews chapter 3 and see something else that Jesus is actually better than. So let's read together where it starts. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who is faithful to him, who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house, if we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Now, the author of Hebrews starts off this part of the letter by giving Jesus two very unique titles, right? Apostle and high priest. Can you guys explain those two positions to me? It's kind of hard, right? The word we translate to apostle, it has a couple of meanings today, right? The first kind of apostle is someone who had a direct knowledge, a direct experience, eyewitness experience with Jesus, and then was sent out as a messenger of the gospel, of the good news. And now there's a finite number of those people that are that kind of apostle because only that generation was able to see Jesus in the flesh. Now another more modern meaning of the word is that someone is sent out as a messenger of the gospel. Now there are some faith traditions that use that term for their leadership. And in our tradition, we don't use that term that way because we feel like every single believer called in Christ is a carrier of the gospel, right? It's part of our call to follow Jesus. We just tell others where our hope comes from. But that is just one of the titles given in this first part of Hebrews 3. The high priest is the other. Now, this one is a more Jewish in tradition, right? The high priest served in the temple and had the responsibility of going into the Holy of Holies. It was a prestigious position, and it had a lot of political power in its time as well. Now, the author gives both of these titles to Jesus, and why do you think that's important? Well, because Jesus really does fill both roles. An apostle is a messenger from God to the people, right? He communicates God's heart and commands, and Jesus did that when he took on flesh and loved and served and taught for 3 years before he went to the cross. Now, a high priest's role is to be a messenger of the people back to God. And Jesus perfectly fills that position as well. Not only was he God in flesh, but he prayed on our behalf to God the Father. And then his death on the cross, guys, it allows us to talk to God the Father now directly, right? The veil between God and mankind was torn with Jesus' sacrifice. And he is the perfect connection between a perfect God and a fallen creation, which is like you and me. So he brings God's word to us in a very living, breathing example, and then carries our concerns to God as a faithful servant. Now, when I read the first part, guys, I think back to John 14:6, right? We said this last week. It says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. Jesus is the only one able to go between us and God the Father, right? He's the only way. The author then turns to a man that was well known to all the Jews and to the new Christians, and that person was Moses. Now, what do you guys remember about Moses and his life, right? He was a great leader. He was just a man, though. Later during his time, he failed in his frustration with the people, and he was unable to enter the promised land at the end of Exodus because of that failure. Moses was the lawgiver for the people, right? He went up to the mountain. He saw God's glory poured out. And then he brought down the 10 Commandments in a tablet form for the people. They loved Moses. They respected him as well. And as the author is about to say, Jesus is even better than your most loved leader, Moses. Jesus was the lawmaker, not just the lawgiver, right? He deserves so much more adoration and glory than a failed man that speaks on God's behalf. And Jesus is so much better. It's important to remember that this letter was written to early Jewish Christians. So this was setting the bar really high for how much better Jesus actually was. Who would you compare Moses to in 2023? Think for just a second. Now, would it be an actor? Would it be a politician, an influencer of some sort, an athlete, pastor, maybe someone else? Think back over history, man. People have always gravitated towards powerful leaders. Now, some of these leaders were good people and they led with integrity. Others were horrible people and they led out of selfishness and out of greed. Now, the good leaders, they actually moved people forward, right? The bad leaders, though, they did evil things to stay in power. And Hebrews 3 reminds us that Jesus is better than even the most amazing leader that we can imagine or that we have experienced in our lives. He is better than any political party or political movement that the world has ever seen. He's better than any government leader. Jesus is better than the MVP of the game or the award-winning actor. Guys, we give control and influence to people that are lesser leaders and ignore the best example that we have in Jesus. Now, as the author closes out this first part of chapter 3, they draw a comparison between Moses and Jesus using two different illustrations. Now, the first one is that Jesus deserves more glory than Moses, just like the builder of the house gets more honor than the building itself. Guys, I follow several architecture accounts on Instagram. I know it's kind of nerdy. Just go with me, right? They have some really cool buildings on there. They catch your eye and they look amazing and there'd be great places to live. But on all those posts, there's a hyperlink to the architect or the firm. The building is great, but the creative idea for that building and its design came from the mind of a crazy talented designer. And Moses is like that house. His great leadership of the people is a testimony to his creator. Jesus is the architect. He deserves more honor than the created thing, which was Moses in this instance. Now, if you keep reading, it talks about how Moses and Jesus were both faithful to their calling in Hebrews 3, 5, and 6, where it says, "Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house if we indeed hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope." Guys, this sounds like they're on the same level, right? They're both faithful. But look at how the author describes each one. Moses is the servant of God. Jesus is the Son of God. Major differences in those two categories. A servant is only a steward of the master's house and has limited freedom. But a son, they have full access to the house, full freedom to choose the actions that they go with, and they have the promise of an inheritance someday. So let's put some handles on this whole discussion, right? When the Jews and the early Christians read this letter to the Hebrews, they would have thought good things when they read the name of Moses, right? It was happy thoughts. He was a loved leader. He held a lot of authority over the people, even after he had died, right? The people had placed their hope in the leadership of Moses, even trusting him to lead them through the desert and the wilderness as they journeyed for those 40 years towards the promised land. The author then takes this well-loved person, familiar to every single person reading the book, and he says, he's great, but Jesus is better. Now, this was probably a ground-shaking statement when it was first penned. The author wanted to turn the attention away from the established system and to ultimately the person of Jesus. The same is true for us today, right? We put our hope in people that can only affect a small part of the bigger system and ignore the one person who actually created the system to begin with and still sustains it today. Moses is impacted by things that happened to him, but Jesus impacts the system. And guys, lives are changed by that impact. Instead of putting our hope in a political party or a system, we need to know that Jesus is better. Instead of putting our hope in a bank account or a retirement fund, guys, we need to know that Jesus is better. Instead of putting our hope in movies or music to escape the system or reality that we feel like is so rotten, Jesus is better. In your small groups tonight, guys, we're going to talk about what we're still holding over Jesus when we think about what's best in our lives, right? We need to tear those things down and let Jesus be better where he belongs in our priorities. I'm going to share this little graphic with you guys on the screen before we move on to Eric Liddell's story. Jesus is more than Moses. The builder is more than the building, and the son is more than the servant. Now, let's go back to our story of Eric. Last week, we heard a little bit about Eric Liddell and how he went to a boarding school thousands of miles away from his parents at the age of 6, and how his parents were missionaries in China, and Eric was growing up in London at the time, right? He was quickly becoming a star athlete at his boarding school, and then later at college, he continued that streak of good athletic results. But even with all the fame that was coming his way, Eric still made time to tell others about Jesus with an organization around London. And Jesus was still better than all the praise that he was getting from coaches and from newspapers. We stopped just short of the 1924 Olympics in Paris, and today we're going to hear about those Olympics and what happened there. Eric's best event was the 100-meter race. He was insanely fast, and he held several national records leading up to these Olympics. Now, the Olympic schedule was released months ahead of time, and Eric saw that the heats were to be ran on a Sunday, and he was convicted about running on Sunday. He didn't want to do it, so he stepped back from the 100-meter race several months before the Olympics. This was his primary race. Instead, though, he turned his attention to training up for the 400-meter, which was considered kind of a middle-distance race at the time, and he wasn't super comfortable with, but he's still fast, right? So the heats were being ran on a Saturday, so it worked out with his schedule. One of the team trainers actually slipped Eric a folded up piece of paper on the day of the race, and he opened it up and it read, "He that honors me, I will honor." And Eric recognized it was 1 Samuel 2:30, and he was so encouraged by the training team supporting his decision to not run on a Sunday. So he took off fast in the 400 when the shot went off, and he got a huge lead by about halfway. But the closing speed of the other runners, because they'd been training at this distance all along, they closed up that gap, but they still weren't fast enough to overtake Eric. He set a European record for the 400 that stood for almost 12 years. He kept on racing at the international level, and he had some great success, but he still wouldn't compete on Sundays. Now, it may sound like this is the highlight of the story, right? The Olympic medal and all this other stuff. Guys, there's still some amazing things coming up for him in his life. We're going to hear about that more next week. So guys, have a great time in small group. We'll see you soon.